Hello and welcome. I'm Kathleen Ernst, the author of the Chloe Ellefson Historic Sites Mystery Series, and I am delighted that you joined me this evening. I'm going to start with a little bit of background for those of you who are new to the series, but most of our time will be spent chatting about some of the important places and themes and ideas that help me develop the story. Now, one of the first questions I often get is, how did you get started doing what you do? And I was very lucky that I grew up in a family with two parents who considered having books in their children's hand was right up there with putting food on plates and sending them to school. I actually have two sisters, and we were lucky enough to visit lots of historic sites when we were growing up. And my mom was a librarian, and she would look for stories, the children's books, to bring home that were set at the time of the site we were visiting or the era. And we'd read them together. So by the time we actually got to Mystic Seaport or Plymouth Plantation, this place was alive in my memory. So my interest in stories and historic places and the meeting between the two of them goes back to early childhood. My mother and I also took another trip the year I graduated from college, which was 1981. Neither one of us had ever been to Wisconsin before, and we decided to just go somewhere where we'd never been. And we visited what was then a pretty young outdoor ethnic museum called Old World Wisconsin in Waukesha County. It's about 600 acres. And at this time, there are some 60, I believe, historic structures that have been relocated from their original locations, saved and moved to the site. And I was so enchanted with the site that I decided I wanted to move to Wisconsin and go to work there. So I started working as a costumed interpreter in 1982. The photograph of me milking a cow, that's actually in one of the Finnish barns. Old World has two different Finnish farms, and I enjoyed working in them very much. I later spent a decade as curator of interpretation and collections. And then in the mid-90s, I moved on. But what I quickly discovered was that I really missed the museum world. I was working for public television, and I enjoyed it very much, but it was all about technology and not interacting directly with people, which I really enjoyed doing. So I did what writers do, and I thought, well, I want to go back to that world, so I'm going to create stories about it. And thus the Chloe Ellefson series was born. Chloe is a curator at Old World, Wisconsin. The books are set in the 1980s, in part because I'm writing from memory, and that's the era that I know. And also because, frankly, it makes it a lot easier to write a murder mystery if your protagonist can't whip out her cell phone and call for help or look things up at every opportunity. So it's been a grand adventure. In each of the mysteries, Chloe's knowledge of the past is needed to solve a present-day mystery. Now, because she has a job that's very much like mine was, I knew that people would wonder if Chloe was really just a lightly fictionalized me, and I wanted to make some distinctions. I am not of Norwegian heritage, and I decided that I would make Chloe of Norwegian heritage. She grew up in the it's known today primarily for its Scandinavian heritage, the town of Stoughton, Wisconsin, in a family that has strong ties to their ethnic roots. And she was a dancer in the very famous dance group, the Stoughton High School Norwegian Dancers. And this photograph is actually of the year that she would have been a member of the dance troupe. Now, Chloe is not a Miss Marple. She has no interest in solving mysteries whatsoever. So I knew I would need a police officer type character. And when I was just starting the series, I approached the chief at the Village of Eagle Police Department, which is the closest village to Old World, Wisconsin, and cautiously asked if he might be interested in or willing to help me out with this project, because I don't know anything about police work. And fortunately for me, he thought this was a great idea. And we often brainstormed ideas, and he came up with suggestions. And I was invited to go on ride-alongs, and sometimes I'd go over and just sit in the corner and just sort of listen to the kind of calls that came in all day. And those experiences helped me create my second primary character, Roelke McKenna, who is a police officer in the village of Eagle. Now, one of my goals for the series from the very beginning was to celebrate the ethnic heritage and cultural diversity of Wisconsin and the broader upper Midwest. And the first 10 books in the series have featured immigrants from Norway, Switzerland, Denmark, Poland, Germany, Cornwall, and Belgium. The 11th book that we're going to talk about tonight adds Finnish heritage to that list. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 Finnish farms, Finnish American farms, that have been restored at Old World, Wisconsin. And even though I knew from the beginning, as I was thinking about creating a Finnish themed book, I didn't plan to set the book at Old World, Wisconsin, but I had to include at least one of the farms. So I started the book at this particular farm. Chloe is visiting the Rankinen farm at Old World, Wisconsin. And I need to mention the lady sitting there at the loom. It is extremely rare. In fact, this may be the first time I've ever done it, where I have created a fictional character in one of my books who is just pitch perfect, a match for a real person. I usually, even if I'm inspired by a real person, I bring in other aspects. But this is Vieno Keskamaki. She was a Finnish American who loved interpreting the Finnish buildings at Old World so much that she left her home in northern Wisconsin and spent her summers living at the Nightcap Inn in Palmyra, and everyone loved her. She was a small elderly woman, and I saw her many times quiet down a group of rowdy school children with just the touch of a hand on a shoulder. And I really wanted to celebrate her. I couldn't write about Old World's Finnish farms without thinking about Vieno. So the character that Chloe meets in the first chapter of the book, if you've read the book already, this is the lady that character is modeled on. The Finnish immigrants as a group and in general came to America a little bit later than some of the other groups that I've written about. In large numbers, they were coming in the latter part of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. By that time, many Finns were just desperate to get out of terrible poverty. They dreamed of having their own land, which was almost impossible for a tenant farmer to accomplish in Finland. And they were also frustrated by increasingly anti-Finnish policies that were being dictated by the Russian government at that time. Now, I love this painting because this is one of the images that I used to describe what a house might look like for an immigrant before they left Finland. And if you note up towards the top of the image, there are rounds of bread hanging on poles to dry. I mentioned those in the book as well. If you couldn't picture them, there they are. Now, one of the things that I often do in the Chloe books, almost always do in the Chloe books, is create a strand of historical fiction that I weave with the Chloe plot line in the 1980s. And the reason that I did that, I've always loved historical fiction. And in my years when I was working as a curator at Old World, Wisconsin, so often I'd come across an object in the collection or some story that gave me just the tiniest peek at someone's life. And there's no way we could ever truly understand what life was like. And when I was employed by the State Historical Society, I could speculate, but I could not fabricate when I was interpreting to guess. And writing historical fiction allows me to fill in the gaps in the historical record. And it also allows you as the reader to get the whole picture. So by the end of the book, you will know a lot more about the whole story than Chloe ever would be able to find out just through research. When I'm starting a new book and considering the historical characters, I often look at a lot of photographs to help me get a sense of what people look like and where they came from and the clothing they wore. And often one picture just calls to me, and I end up using those real people to help me as inspiration to help me create my own fictional characters. In the case of The Weaver's Revenge, the two main characters in my fictional story are Lena and Maddie. They are sweethearts, and all they want is to get married and one day have a farm and a family of their own in Finland. And because that was a very tricky proposition, Maddie decides pretty quickly that the only way he can make that work is by going to America, earning a lot of money, and then bringing it home so he can do that. Now, unfortunately, it was not uncommon for this to happen in lots of countries, but especially in Finland. And because the poverty was so bad for the people who were thinking about leaving, it was very common that there was not enough money for more than one person to go. So often the man of the couple or the family would scrape up enough coins to get themselves to America, but they would have to leave their wives and their families behind. Many people hoped to return to Finland, as Maddie did. Other people said, as soon as I raise enough money, I will send passage for you, and then you can come join me in our new lives in America. Often this took years for families to be reunited again, and occasionally the letters just stopped coming and any wages stopped coming, and the woman was left to wonder. This was such a common phenomena that these women were known as America widows in Finland, or a more colorful term from Finland is widow of the grasses. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it's certainly an evocative term. These women were effectively widowed, but a few women did manage to make their way to Michigan in search of the husbands that seem to have been swallowed up in America. And I'm going to read a short newspaper clipping that was published in 1905. The sensation among the people on Pine Street is the case of Herman Dahl, the Finlander who has been living here for several months with a woman he claimed was his legitimate wife. Yesterday, his first wife and daughter, a girl about 16, arrived from the old country and at once hunted up her faithless husband. Well, she found him, and after some talk between them, he agreed to leave his second wife and live with the first wife. Although he had done her a great wrong, she was willing to forgive him if he would now take care of his family, which included 6 children. Another of my early goals, as I was just conceptualizing the series at the very beginning, I wanted to celebrate very special historic sites and places in the area. So I needed to find a real historic site with Finnish background to serve as the primary setting for The Weaver's Revenge. And I settled on the Hanka Homestead Finnish Museum in northern Michigan. And for me, and I think for Chloe, any site sign that includes a caution that the approach road is impassable when wet is a good sign. The Hanka Homestead Museum is in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Upper Michigan. The land here was originally homesteaded by the Hanka family, and they arrived in 1896 and took out the claim on 40-acre homestead. Now, the patriarch of the family Herman Hanka, had already filed a homestead claim in another state as he made his way across and up to Michigan. So the homestead in Michigan needed to be claimed by someone else. That was the way the law worked. So his eldest daughter, named Mary, who was the taller woman in the one photograph of the two women, she's there with her mother, Mina. Mary actually legally filed the homestead claim, which is pretty awesome. She was known to be a very strong-willed and strong-minded woman. She did work very hard to get the homestead established with her dad and brothers and meet the requirements. She did cook in a lumber camp kitchen often during the winters to earn a little bit of extra money. Her mother, Mina, there on the side, was a much more frail woman. She had some health problems, but she was remembered quite fondly by people in the neighborhood. Herman Hanka himself had tried to earn money in addition to homesteading by working in a local mine, as so many of the men did. And unfortunately, he survived what was a horrific and tragic mining accident. And folks say he was never quite the same after that. I'm sure he was traumatized. He was also injured in the accident. That might be another reason why Mary took such a strong role. Mary at one point got pregnant, and she chose not to marry the father of her baby, because if she had done so, her legal control of the homestead would have passed on to him, and she was not willing to do that. The Hankas did manage to establish a successful farm despite the fact that the land was cut over, which means the lumber companies had come through, and they were all it was stump land for acres and acres, and the short growing season. Sadly, the youngest of the Hanka family passed away. He had no children, and by the 1980s, the early 1980s, this farm was in very, very bad shape. It had been abandoned and was really just caving in the forest. And then something very special and wonderful happened. This is Al Pape. Alan and I were colleagues way back in the day when he was the restoration director at Old World, Wisconsin, and he oversaw, before the site was opened, he oversaw moving the buildings and restoring all the buildings, and helped identify the buildings that would come. And by the early 1980s, he was searching for a Finnish farm that he could restore on location if possible, and otherwise he was looking for buildings that he could relocate to preserve them. So often an owner can't afford to maintain a century-old building. Someone told him about the Hanka Homestead, and he realized that this was this amazing thing, an entire farmstead still standing and on its original location. That's very, very rare. So he had a dream of preserving the buildings where they stood, and then helping the local community start a small museum there. And he had a lot of help, but it was all done on a shoestring budget and a lot of volunteer hours. No, because I knew Alan, we went up and took a tour together, and he shared a lot of his archival materials with me. And this provided me as a novelist a unique opportunity to delve into the pre-opening stage of building a historic site, creating a historic site. And so I did use his story, all of his memories, and the things that he so generously shared with me to actually shape the entire plot. Character Mike in The Weaver's Revenge his project is based on Alan's work. His personality is not. The murder and mayhem, no connection to the actual events. The premise of The Weaver's Revenge is that Mike has decided to do this, save this crumbling homestead, and he invites Chloe to come up on a consulting gig and give him some advice in the very early days. And that's what sets the book in motion. People often ask how I choose the settings for each new Chloe book, because I do enjoy getting her out and about. And there's actually a list of things that I have to keep in mind before I can make the choice. First and foremost, it has to be a site that I really love and that I think Chloe would really love. We have a lot of things in common, Chloe and I, so that's pretty easy to figure out. But I knew from the first time that I drove up to the farm and drove down that road that's impassable when wet, that this was a place I'd be very happy to spend a lot of time exploring and then also living in that space in my mind for a year as I wrote the Chloe story. This site also gave me the opportunity to do something I'd wanted to do for a while, which is showcase a small, lesser known site that has managed to survive due to dedicated volunteers. It's easy to focus on the big sites that get a lot of funding, not that any historic sites get a lot of funding these days, but it was great fun to show what a small group of determined individuals could accomplish. And the site is thriving today, which is a joy. I also need to think about the fact that I am creating a mystery plot. And I need enough geography to do that. I need enough geography to get my characters in trouble. So a one-room log cabin, is as charming as it might be, won't suit the bill. But this was a large site that's still in a rural area. In Chloe's time, there was no food, no phone, no way to get help of any kind. And there's lots of terrain here. So I knew I could make that work for a mystery plot. And finally, I look for sites. I often consider sites for many years, but I wait for a time when something about the site story will allow me to reflect the emotional journey that my main characters are taking. At the end of the 10th Chloe Ellefson Mystery, small spoiler here, but Chloe and Roelke get married. And so at the beginning of the 11th Chloe mystery, Chloe's trying to figure out what this means for her as an individual. What does she want her marriage to look like? And Mary Hanka's story and the choices that she made about marriage provided a great mirror to let me do that. And I looked for other opportunities to bring in the question of different choices that people make about their identities as part of a married couple. I also have to consider, now that I'm 10 or 11 books into the series, I like to try to keep things as fresh as I can for you, the readers. And I have written several Chloe books that are set at a farm. I've written a couple of different dramatic scenes that took place in barns. So I didn't want to do the same thing with this book. And there were two structures in particular that I found interesting and that had never been mentioned in an earlier Chloe book. The log structure that's on the hill is the sauna. And this little building down the lower building is the milk house. And I wanted to show you this wide shot so you can see the bridge. There's a little creek that runs along under the bridge and under the building. So this is the interior of the sauna. And the first slide, the larger slide, shows a little bit of how an old smoke sauna, that's the Finnish pronunciation, the mechanics of it. There's a large pile of rocks and there's space to build a fire underneath. It takes hours to keep the fire going and heat up all the rocks. That's the idea. There's water and a dipper usually inside the sauna. And when the rocks are perfectly hot, the first bathers go into the sauna and pour cold water on those rocks, and that's what creates the steam. Usually the men went in first because that's when it was the hottest. Now, the Finnish sauna is so ubiquitous that in the area of northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota that was heavily settled by Finns, that region is often called the sauna belt. Sauna is the only Finnish word that has made it into international dictionaries. And for Finnish Americans, yes, this is a place to take a steam bath, but the tradition implies something much deeper than that. The sauna was a place to refresh oneself and their connections with family or friends or neighbors. For some, it was a healing place, and for some, it was a spiritual place as well. The photograph on the right that has the cow horn sitting on the soap holder, a lot of healing took place. If people were sick or unwell or giving birth, they often went to the sauna. It was peaceful and quiet and clean. The cupping horn there is part of a tradition that goes back centuries in many cultures, but certainly in Finland. And for certain kinds of ailments, the practitioners would make little slits, often on the neck and shoulders, I understand, to get rid of the bad blood. And then they would use the cow horn to provide suction and to help those bad humors flow out of the body. Here's a closer view of the milk house. And you can't see the water here, but you can see where all the nice greenery is. And here's the inside of the milk house, and that dark rectangle on the floor, that is the open hatch. So once milking was done or cream separator had been worked, the family could put their dairy products in containers, milk cans or other containers, and lower them right through that hatch where you see the grass floating. The stream is very shallow, but it would certainly help keep things warm or cool, I'm sorry. And that was quite a luxury for an early family. If they didn't have that type of arrangement before they had any cool places constructed, some people would have to dig pits and bury their dairy in the soil trying to keep it cool. Now, one of the things I always take a lot of joy in, and it was one of my goals when I started the series, and that is celebrating folk arts and traditions. And often they're fairly decorative things like Norwegian rose mauling or Polish paper cutting or Belgian lace. In this case, I decided to focus on the long-standing Finnish tradition of weaving rag rugs. Many cultures produced rag rugs, but the Finns were particularly good at it. These are some historic examples, and even though the pattern is as patterns go, a simple stripe, the color is just beautiful, and they're even and they're very tightly made. Another thing that makes rug weaving special for Finns is that the tradition never died out like so many traditions did that had to be revived later on. This has been a continual tradition up to the present day. Finns were used to seeing rag rugs everywhere in the old country. This is a market, an outdoor market where rugs were offered for sale. Don't you wish you could stroll through one of those today? And even in this black and white photo, you get a sense that there's a lot of color and design and pattern in these rugs. Finns also had, in many communities, days that were set aside for a community rug washing day, and they would put big racks out in a long, long line, and everyone would bring their rugs to the lakeside or the riverside and wash them, and then they'd have a social time and a picnic. These are three examples of early rugs. You can see some of them are quite plain and utilitarian. We have a traditional pattern in the center, which would require 4 harnesses on a loom to make. And then the one on the right actually intrigues me. The diamonds, overall diamond pattern is very common, but the selection with the dark diamonds and the pale ones interspersed there with the overall pattern is very interesting for the time. This is a close-up of an old Finnish rug, and I wanted you to be able to see the complexity of the weaving pattern that the weaver put into this rug. This would require, I believe, I believe this was done on a 4 harness loom. But not only did she include the stripes, but the different color stripes have different patterns. So she worked the treadles in a different way as she was weaving this rug. It's really spectacular craftsmanship. Now in the book, Chloe's interest in Finnish rag rugs is inspired when she finds by chance an old antique rug, Finnish rug, and it had sort of an undulating pattern that reminded her of waves. And this is a pattern, this particular rug, the weaver called it Over the Waves. And this is the kind of pattern that inspired me to include that in the book. And you can certainly see that movement in the way the yarn was, or the weft was treadled in there. And this is an example with 2 colors, which I think is very effective. Here's a similar pattern, and this weaver called hers Big Lake Wave, but she chose to use a lot of color in the stripes, so we get a very different look there. This is the kind of rug that you may be most familiar with in terms of rag rugs. Weavers called this hit and miss, meaning that they used whatever materials were at hand. And this type of rug could be done on a 2 harness loom, which is a little simpler. And often a lot of care went into the colors in broad terms, but there's no definitive stripes or pattern in them. And I think this trait, they seem plain, and a lot of people might think, well, that's not much of a folk art. In fact, in the book, Chloe's obnoxious boss tells her not to study this on state time because, as he summarized it, rags were made into rugs, end of story. And one of the aspects that I enjoyed the most about digging into this story was learning how wrong Chloe's boss really was. The social history in the Finnish communities behind these rugs is complex and often very poignant. First of all, Finns were known for their frugality, and so the women took pride in using every scrap that they could. Sometimes they made memory quilts, or like memory quilts, they made memory rugs, that's what they called them, where they could sit and look down and recognize fabrics that had belonged to loved ones. It also gave isolated poor women the chance to learn a little extra money to contribute to the household. And that was, I'm sure, very good for self-esteem, but it was also desperately needed. And people talked about how their mom, who was a weaver, was primarily responsible for getting their family through the Great Depression, for example, because they earned enough money doing this that they could still put a little bit of food on the table. And one of the things, I read a lot of accounts, because happily a lot of field work has been done by a local historian on this whole topic. And one of the things that really struck me was the women that talked about how much it meant to them emotionally. This was a way for them to be creative and expressive in a way that was still practical. And their lives were very hard. They were living in a brutal environment as far as getting farms started. A lot of their husbands were off in the mines or off in the lumber camps, but they could sit down and weave. And I'm just going to share a few words from one woman who was remembering what weaving meant to her. And she said, it was kind of a sanctuary away from everything. If life gets real busy and stressed, I can just sit down and do my weaving, and that's all that's important at that moment. Everything else is somewhere else. It's my time for me to calm down. And I can certainly imagine women walking out to their weaving sheds. Women also talked about how you have to, it's heavy work to work a big, heavy loom. And women talked about how if they got mad at something, they'd go out there and beat on the rug for a while at their loom. Great for resolving frustrations. Here's one of their looms. This is what's called a tree loom or a root loom. And Finnish carpenters, Finns were in general very good woodworkers. And if their wife wanted a loom, they would just go out in the forest and look for a tree that they could cut down and make a loom for her. And they often looked for damaged or diseased or uprooted trees. And they had an eye for looking how some of the curves in the wood could be incorporated right into the design. So it's not all sharp angles. These looms were also very, very heavy. And in the middle of the picture there is the beater bar, and that's what women would thump to get that nice tight weave and get out all their frustrations. This is another example of one of those root looms. This has a lovely line to it with that curve. And the close-up is of the reed loom, the loom's reed. And a reed is what keeps all the threads evenly spaced as the weaver is working. And in The Weaver's Revenge, Chloe is thrilled to find an old discarded reed, homemade reed, in the trash pile behind the Hanka buildings. And this is what it would have looked like. I cannot imagine the workmanship because it's very, very delicate work. These are some of the other artifacts that I chose to incorporate into the story, such as birch bark woven shoes. The Finns were superb workers with birch bark. Here's a birch bark knapsack that I imagined Matty carrying as he tromped away from his farm. I found this necklace early on in my research, and I was so enamored with it that I used it as a model for a necklace that Lena receives in this story. This is such tiny, delicate work. The beads are made of wound tiny strips of birch bark, and the three-dimensional ones are tiny pieces of birch bark that's folded to make those beads. And another very common Finnish artifact that I used in the book is a special Finnish knife. Almost all Finlanders carried them, men certainly, but often women too. They were used for hunting and fishing and any chore that just needed to be done. And sometimes they were beautifully made. And this is one of the knives that I used to help me describe a knife in the story. So I hope you've enjoyed this little glimpse of how The Weaver's Revenge came to be and the places and people and stories that inspired it. And I encourage you to visit the Hanka Homestead and other Finnish sites if you are ever traveling through the UP or Northern Michigan or Minnesota as well. If you're interested in this type of topic, I just want to mention 3 other books that are on my shelf that you might be interested in. Balancing is my first collection of poetry, and the subtitle is Poems of Female Immigrant Experience in the Upper Midwest, 1830 to 1930. And several of the poems in there have to do with Finnish settlers. A Settler's Year is a nonfiction book that I did for the Wisconsin Historical Society. It's primarily a woven collection of firsthand accounts. It's nice to hear from people in their own words. And all the photographs were taken at Old World, Wisconsin. And finally, I recently started a new series. I'm still writing Chloe books, never fear. Lies of a Mission, however, is the first book in my new Hanka Bauer mystery series. And Hanka Bauer is a Pomeranian immigrant. I love sharing some of my adventures and the fascinating things that I learn with readers. And you can always keep up and find more information on my website, which is kathleenertz.com. On my blog, I try to provide a lot of backstories, explaining what's in books are true and recipes from the books and things like that. And I'm also active on Facebook if you are as well. Thank you again for joining me this evening, and happy reading.